The story that we have in today's gospel is a very typical example of Mark's writing in his gospel. We started with a story about a synagogue leader named Jairus, about his daughter who was ill, and we ended with the story of the synagogue leader and his daughter. And in the middle, there was another story that sort of interrupted the story about the woman with the hemorrhage. We call this by a very technical name. This is called a Markan sandwich. You know, think of two pieces of bread. You got the Jairus story on the outside, that's the bread, and in the middle you got the meat. You got the story of the woman with the hemorrhage. Mark uses this in his gospel, and he even uses this sandwich as part of a bigger layer of sandwiches. It's like this, you know, palindromes, Madam, I'm Adam. You can read it forward or backward. So actually the technical term, it does have a technical term. It comes from the Greek letter, it looks like an X to us, but it's a chi, like sigma chi. So chi, and the technical term is chiasm, because it begins and comes to the middle, and then it turns and goes back to the beginning. So an example of a chiasm here in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, the Sabbath for humankind was made, not humankind for the Sabbath. So in the first sentence, the word Sabbath is repeated in the last phrase. The second phrase, humankind, is repeated in the second to last phrase. And then in the middle, was made, is not repeated. And so it's this center, the center of the X is where Mark is leading us in the story. So in this chiasm, this sandwich that we had today, it's part of a larger chiasm that began last Sunday when Jesus was going in the boat with his disciples to the other side. Of course, there was a storm because the storm represented this mission to the Gentiles. The disciples were in the boat and they were afraid. This is chapter 4. In chapter 6 in Mark's Gospel, at the end of this section, the disciples are once again out in a boat, and once again there's a storm, but Jesus is not with them. He's up on the mountain praying, and so he comes down and walks on the water to them, and they are afraid. They think they're seeing a ghost. So in the beginning of this chiasm and at the end, the disciples are pretty faithful. They're afraid all the way through. Last week we went to the Gerasenes. We did not hear that story today. We came back on the other side. But when he was in the land of the Gerasenes, the Gentile territory, and you know that because it turns out there is a herd of pigs there. And of course, Jews don't have pigs. So this man who was possessed by demon, their legion, and they begged Jesus not to kill them, but to send them into the pigs, which of course a good Jewish boy was happy to do. And the pigs went running down the cliff and drowned in the Sea of Galilee, whereupon the pig herders' union came to Jesus and begged him to leave their town. They were afraid of what he would do to their commerce, not to mention other things. So the Gerasenes were afraid and they begged him to leave. Next Sunday, we find Jesus going to his hometown of Nazareth. They're not afraid, but they beg him to leave. So Mark is repeating the pattern. So today we begin with the story of Jairus, who is afraid. His daughter is close to death, and he has deep fear that only death can evoke in us. And as they are going to the house, as the story turns, Jesus says, "Do not fear, only believe." And then in the middle, that's not duplicated, we have this story of a woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years. That number is significant. That represents Israel, all of Israel's history. This is an issue that's kind of part of our humanness, and it's been with us always. Actually, she breaks the law by coming in and touching Jesus. She was supposed to keep her distance so as not to make somebody ritually impure. And Jesus' disciples really have a good idea. Why bother? Because if you are touched by a woman who's bleeding, you become ritually impure. It really would be smart if you didn't let anybody know. But of course, Jesus is not taking their advice. He wants to know. The woman is afraid. She comes before him in fear and trembling. But she pushes past her fear and she tells him the whole truth. In all these stories, in this little section of Mark's Gospel, 5 of the 12 mentions of the word fear are in this section. And in all of these stories, fear is like a threshold moment. It's an opportunity to be awakened to something deeper. But the disciples stay in their fear. They never cross over. They never move beyond their fear. But this woman, Mark wants us to notice this woman because even though she comes in fear and trembling and falls down before him, she pushes past her fear and tells him the whole truth. She speaks of her experience. She testifies in the midst of the crowd about what has happened within her. And Jesus calls her daughter. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Because as we heard in the book of Wisdom, God did not make death. God does not desire death, but rather the wholeness, the generative nature of creation is wholesome and good. God desires wholeness and healing. So Jesus calls her by her true, deep identity as a daughter of God, rather than by a woman who is afflicted with a flow of blood. After the girl is raised from death, everybody there is amazed. And we might think, well, that's a pretty good place to be. But think of, how you go through a maze, you get into a maze and you kind of get lost. Amazement's like that. It's not faith. Amazement really is lost. So Jesus is inviting us into this threshold moment. And the woman is our model for moving through our fear into faith. Well, back in 1982, I kind of set out to kind of experience this sense of faith and trust. I was with, for a year at St. Thomas Aquinas in Detroit, I was with Father Leo Sabrin. And Leo helped me understand that the biblical sense of hospitality is really very important. So Abraham welcomed the 3 visitors, and it turned out they were angels, and Abraham and Sarah bore the child of promise. We might welcome strangers and unwittingly welcome angels, we read in the New Testament. So Leo would go all over the world as a pilgrim, and then he would come back and he'd tell how he had been welcomed as a stranger. So I thought, well, I'm going to try that. I want to put this into practice and go take a trip and see what it's like to be welcomed as a stranger. I wanted to deliberately go not as a priest, because of course if I went as a priest, people, oh, Father, come on in, but I wanted to go as a stranger and experience this. So I decided to go camping in New England. And as I've told this story over the years, people have said, well, that was quite an act of faith in itself to go to New England and expect to be welcomed. So I set out. It was just this time of year because, in fact, the Sunday when I went to church, the gospel was this same gospel. But the first week, the whole week was like yesterday. It was cold and rainy. On Thursday night, we had snow. I remember checking into a motel instead of the campground. There was nobody out. So nobody welcomed me. I didn't see anybody. But by Friday, Saturday, the weather was beginning to get better. And I remember Saturday morning, in my prayer times, reflecting, and it kind of came to me that I was supposed to welcome somebody first. And I remember saying, no, I'm the stranger. I'm not from here. Somebody's supposed to welcome me. No, it was real clear I was supposed to take the first step. So I thought, well, okay. So I went around the campground searching for some victims. And I settled on these 2 young men. It turned out they were from Switzerland. One of them was named Pius. I can't remember the other one's name. But they had come to Florida first. We're in Maine. They're going on to Chicago and then Seattle. Europeans have no concept of the vastness of this country. Well, they came for dinner. They came back in the morning for breakfast. I think they came to get to dinner again that next night. We'd kind of hit a rhythm. And I went to church that morning. It was in Ellsworth, Maine, a little church, St. Joseph Church. It's still there. I found these pictures. And I sat down in front of this couple who, they had a couple little children. They didn't know I was a priest. We visited a little bit when I came in. And after Mass, they invited me to their home for breakfast. And, I almost didn't go. I thought, I don't even know these people. It was like a moment of this is it, And so, of course, I went, and then I did tell them I was a priest, and I still remember our conversation. But it wasn't until I took the first step that sort of unlocked that whole process. And really, after that, pretty much every day, I encountered somebody who was a welcoming person. So it's that experience that kind of helped me understand what's Mark trying to help us see here in the story about this woman in the midst of this story about the synagogue leader. So Jairus is a synagogue leader. Now that means he's a pastor. He could even be, we might even say he's a pastor of a Christian community, because it's unusual for a synagogue leader to talk to Jesus in the way he does. A lot of times in the Gospels, they're pretty resistant to Jesus. But he's a pastor of a community, and he has a daughter who is ill. Now, if the daughter dies, the daughter, of course, represents the next generation. She's our future. And Mark tells us, almost as an aside, she was 12 years old. What does that mean? That means she's at the age of adulthood. She's about to enter into being a woman. And as a woman, she is generative. She can bring life. She can bear children. If she dies, there will be no children. So the life of the church is threatened. What will bring life to the church? And the answer that Mark is telling us, if you want to have life and have it abundantly, here's what you do. Take care of the most vulnerable. Take care of that old woman whose life is nearly exhausted, who is completely excluded. Include her, and your future will be secure. This is what Paul was talking about as a pastor of the church in Corinth. He said it's a question of fair balance between your present abundance and their need. For it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. From this perspective, a good life for me starts with a good life for you. I really believe that social justice is really good self-interest. If I help make the world a better place for you, it ends up being a better place for me. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, again and again returns to our care for our common home, beginning with the poor, who suffer the most from environmental change and yet have the least capacity to do anything about it. In a time of crisis, when our future is threatened, we want to hold on to the past, maintain the status quo. People who deny that we're in climate change are a good case in point. Fear paralyzes us. In the aftermath of the killing in the church in South Carolina last week, I questioned whether we would be able to confront our racism, to talk about taking down the Confederate flag, and whether we could begin to deal with gun violence. The gospel calls this a threshold moment, an invitation to move beyond inertia, to push through our fears to faith. Like the woman in the gospel, we are called to push past our fear and speak the whole truth. Racism and gun violence are not separate issues. They're interwoven, just as the fibers in the cloth of the flag are woven together to make a single piece of cloth. In an act of civil disobedience yesterday morning, Bree Newsom, wearing a helmet and using tree climbing equipment, scaled a 30-foot flagpole in front of the State House in South Carolina. Before she reached the top, she was confronted by the state Capitol Police and told to come down, but she went upward. We removed the flag today, she said, because we couldn't wait any longer. On the way down, she quoted Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom should I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom should I be afraid? Pope Francis offers a model of a man who broke through the culture of his time to live a life of faith in a new way. He quotes St. Francis of Assisi in his Canticle of the Creatures, Laudato si, mi Signore, praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. St. Francis reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. Pope Francis ends his call to care for our common earth with a prayer. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing and to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light.